Again, thank you. I want to start by thanking Lucy and Lauren for inviting me to this seminar. And the title of my talk, you can see it on the slide, Women's Coping Strategies in Violent Environments and the Role of Home. And I'm going to focus on the case of Medellín, Colombia. I'm actually going to focus on women community leaders living in low-income neighborhoods controlled by criminal groups known locally as combos in Medellín. And I'll talk about their experiences in the neighborhoods, and I will talk about the role of home in these strategies. And towards the end of the talk, I'll mention some of the experiences of women community leaders during the pandemic. So violence is a serious issue in Latin America. It's not a safe place for women. Some organizations and scholars have labeled it as an epidemic. For instance, the United Nations reports that 1 in 3 women in Latin America will experience some form of violence based on their gender in their lifetime. So that's pretty high. And Colombia is no exception through violence. Though violence occurs in rural and urban areas, in this talk, I will focus on women's experiences in urban contexts, and more specifically in these low-income neighborhoods. Some of these neighborhoods are controlled by groups involved in criminal activities. Most of the members are young male adolescents, young male adults, and they pretty much set the tone in the neighborhood. This is not exclusive to Medellín. This happens to other cities in Latin America, such as in San Salvador, San Pedro Sula, in Honduras. These combos, as they are known in Medellín, they decide who enters the turf. They control illicit markets. They engage in violence against rivals, and even in some cases with residents. They are a daily presence in the neighborhood. And for many residents, leaving the neighborhood is just not an option. In fact, it's the last option. And women, this is their case as well, they carry out many activities in the neighborhood, in their home, and leaving when they have any sort of confrontation with these combos. They don't think of relocating. It's not really a viable solution. So instead they try to stay. And one of the questions that emerged in this research that I'm conducting with the research team was, how do women deal with these environments that are characterized by violence and crime? And what you see on the slide is a picture of one of the neighborhoods where we conducted our research, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes. It's Comuna 8. Okay, so the argument that I want to develop a bit here in this short time is that women living in these environments of violence and crime do not leave their neighborhoods, and instead what they do is develop strategies to cope in these environments, as well as with the actors that play a role in reproducing these contexts of violence and crime, such as criminal groups, in this case, combos. And home here plays an important part in these strategies. And I think it's important to point out that home is not exclusive to these strategies, but it does play a role in them. And it contributes by maintaining women's care networks, which is very important among these women community leaders. It reinforces their autonomy, and it also reinforces their agency. Okay, so this is a map of Medellín, and this is where I've been conducting research in the past years. I'm based in Medellín. I live there, and this research, as I said, it focuses on women community leaders' strategies in low-income neighborhoods. Medellín is divided into administrative units that are known as comunas. And my research focused on 3 comunas that you can see circled on the slide: Comuna 1, 3, and 8. They're on the northeast side of the municipality, of the urban part of the municipality. There are rural and urban land use in the municipality of Medellín, and we focused this research in the urban areas, which are these comunas. And Medellín has a history of criminal groups and violence. It was once the city with the highest homicide rate on the planet, in part because of the criminal organizations. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the local government, along with central government, worked to decrease the levels of violence and crime. And they introduced various social policies. One of them is the very famous social urbanism. And I will not get into all of this history because it's beyond like the scope of this talk. But I just want to point out that despite these government attempts and the introduction of these social policies, to this day, there is still a considerable presence of criminal groups in the city. They have reorganized, restructured, they have established alliances, and there are various types of criminal groups, but the one I'm going to focus on mainly are the ones that are that operate more on a very local level that are called combos, and they resemble like street gangs. It's not very clear how many combos there are in Medellin, but one report that I read mentioned that there were around 300 combos in Medellin. So these, as most street gangs, combos are territorial and they control turfs. This allows them to dominate resources, illicit markets, licit markets, and also residents. Not all combos are alike, and they generally will control certain public spaces in the neighborhood. They, in some cases, they can be involved in certain community decisions, and in some cases, they provide certain services such as security, protection. In some cases, they borrow money. They can decide on food, for instance. So their presence is constant. And women, of course, as other residents, have to deal with them on almost practically on a daily basis. So given this broad context, my question here was, how do women cope in these environments? So far, what we have seen, based on in-depth interviews with various women community leaders from these three comunas, is that they develop coping strategies. And so far we have identified three, and I'll briefly just talk about them. One of them is confrontation. So this type of strategy refers to interactions that involve some sort of unresolved disagreement between women community leaders and combos. And an example would be something, for instance, that came up in our interviews is when one women community leader who has a son in a combo. She had previously cooperated with combo members, in part because of this relationship that her son was in the combo, and also because she knew them, because most of the community leaders have been living in these neighborhoods for many, many years. And instead of cooperating with them, the combos wanted information where her son was, and she confronted them, simply not giving information and just confronting them. And one could read this simply as a mother trying to protect her son, but it actually, in the context of this neighborhood with the presence of combos, what it shows is that she is challenging this authority, this status quo. Another strategy is negotiation, and this refers through which how women community leaders bargain security for themselves and for other residents and even family members. And this is a bit regarding their social position as community leaders within the neighborhood. And one example is one community leader, for instance, mentioned how she was able to negotiate with combos because she knew them, and I mentioned this recently, like they generally know them because they have been living many, many years in the neighborhood and have seen them, know them before they enter the combo. And also because they have this work within the community, somehow the combos respect them, like they sort of like consider them, sort of respect within the neighborhood. So this gives them, the women community leaders, some sort of leverage to negotiate things with them. And for instance, some things that they are able to negotiate is like not to harm some residents. But negotiation also occurs when they, for instance, bring some projects to, sometimes they need the approval of the combo to carry out some community projects. And so they start negotiating with them in order to carry out certain projects in the neighborhood. Or they might negotiate with them certain supplies that they give or services. Another strategy that I'll mention is avoiding confrontation. And this refers to women's actions that do not defy the combo's authority, nor do they reinforce the combo. And in other words, what they're trying to do is not to interfere and try to have no contact with them, which is sometimes is difficult, in order to not be bothered by them. So one community leader, for instance, who has her own business in her home, she just gave them service and did not discriminate them, as maybe some other business owners do. And she just wanted to not have any problems with them. So this is like another strategy. And of course, I have many more examples, but I just want to give you an idea of some coping strategies that they have. And here the question again is what role does home play? And just before I get into that, I just want you to know what I have in mind when I think about home. It's of course a lot more than the physical structure, but home also has it's a signifying social relations for these women. And I think it's important to point out that many of the women in these neighborhoods, as I mentioned, had been living there for so many years, and some of them even had built their homes. And they had built their homes based on their needs. So the whole distribution and the architecture of the home is very different from, for instance, social housing, for instance. So with that in mind, what is the role of home? So home is part of the strategies of women in living in these neighborhoods. Home is a central place where women carry out their care activities, such as looking after children, family members, or the children of other neighbors. And this is the case of some of the projects or care activity networks that they had established, known as community mothers. In Spanish, it's called Madres Comunitarias. Care activities are generally unpaid, and this has to do with the whole asymmetrics behind gender relations. But community leaders set care networks in order to help other residents with care activities, which can become very burdensome at some point. And without a home, this network simply would not function. So home there is very important. Home also helps them develop autonomy, and I mentioned that some of them have built their homes. So this gives them, of course, some level of autonomy and what they do in their homes. And many of them, for instance, had set up their own businesses. They had like small farms with small farm animals where they like chickens, and they need this land in order to carry out like their own, well, to have some sort of subsistence of food and of their own businesses. So it just helps them to develop some sort of income and autonomy, where many of them are single mothers and they're head of the household. And home is also a place of safety for them, and for some women community leaders. For instance, in many of the interviews, they use home as a place where they go out and rescue, for instance, some women who have been victims of intimate partner violence or who have been attacked by a combo member. And so they use the home as a place where they can protect other women. So this is some examples of how the role of home. This really did not come out from this research. It's from another research, but I thought it was important to mention that home also acquires a political dimension. This, as I mentioned, did not appear in this research, but for women's grassroots movements in Medellín, and this is one of the largest ones, which is called Mesa de Trabajo Mujer Medellín, home is part of their agenda. Which they make demands vis-a-vis the local government. So home there acquires a political dimension. And to finish, what happened during the pandemic? Well, COVID impacted, of course, many women in general, and I think on the planet, Colombia, of course, as well. And this was not the aim of the research, but we conducted it during the pandemic, and of course, the women community leaders mentioned it at some point. And what I noticed is that the notions of home, which are originally linked to autonomy, protection, even agency, the reinforcement of care activities started to change, especially during these very harsh lockdowns of the Colombian government. For some women, home became a place of limitations, as they couldn't go out, they could hardly continue with their businesses. Women community leaders, for instance, do workshops in the neighborhoods in order to make residents aware of, well, it depends on the project, but in some cases about gender or autonomy of women. And of course, lockdowns hindered these spaces, and so they were forced to stay home. They also had to rethink their care activity networks, and they usually, like I said, they went to other houses and checked on other women. But of course, with the lockdowns, that meant that they had to rely more on internet, WhatsApp, and this meant that they had to buy mobile data, and this was not within their budget. So it complicated things in terms of maintaining the care network that they already had. And finally, in terms of the strategies that I mentioned, the one that seemed to appear most was the confrontation strategy with combos, specifically during the lockdowns, because they became intimidating a lot more. And they did mention that they started to confront them a lot more often than before the lockdowns. So just to show that the notion of home underwent some changes, in our conversations with women community leaders. And I'll leave it here. I think my time is up, and so I'll take your questions and comments after the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.